Well, thanks, Cam, for that introduction. And thank you too for Donna for that talk earlier in the night. That's going to be a hard act to follow. Ever since I was a boy, I've loved awe-inspiring technology. And I was naturally drawn to aerospace engineering as a career where I could really engage with technology at the sharp edge. That aircraft you see there, I was lucky enough to work on 3 weeks after graduating. They were crazy to let me work on it, but I was privileged to have that opportunity. Growing up, one of my heroes was the great Wernher von Braun, probably the greatest aerospace engineer in history. He was a formidable intelligence, an impressive presence, the designer of the mighty Saturn V rocket, which would eventually take man to the moon. And von Braun wrote extensively on the topic of science and faith. And he firmly believed that science and religion were not antagonists, but sisters. He firmly believed that the cosmos was the work of a mighty designer, a master planner. He wrote, "I find it as difficult to understand a scientist who does not acknowledge the presence of a superior rationality behind the existence of the universe as it is to comprehend a theologian who would deny the advances of science." Another one of my heroes is Dr. Francis Collins, and you may have seen his recent interview in National Geographic. Dr. Collins is an extremely accomplished and distinguished physician and geneticist. He is director of the National Institutes of Health and former leader of the Human Genome Project. And in this interview with National Geographic, he said, "I find it oddly anachronistic that in today's culture, there seems to be a widespread presumption that scientific and spiritual views are incompatible." Why did he say this? Why does this outstanding scientist believe, as did Wernher von Braun and as do I, that a harmonious relationship can and should exist between science and faith? And more importantly, why do equally distinguished scientists like Richard Dawkins, who gets a lot of airtime, take a much more hostile view? Why the disconnect? Well, the reasons are complex, but primarily I think that science frequently gets appropriated into much larger warfare between worldviews. If we're honest, we'd say the cold hard fact is, at this moment in the early 21st century, it's easy to see where religions of the most retrograde sorts are causing a lot of human suffering. Religious arguments are sometimes used to prevent women from driving or voting. Some religions can kill you for renouncing your faith. Priests have abused the innocent. People have mistreated those supposed to be in their care. Young women have to undergo FGM, and same-sex attracted young people can be bullied for their sexual orientation. And frankly, I can understand the religious critic who rails against these things. They've got a point. I don't want those things either. And in this context, it's only understandable that someone might want to look around urgently for a silver bullet that could be used to shoot down superstitious beliefs, all of them, once and for all. Enter science. It's a formidable weapon. It's authoritative. It has brought us spectacular successes in medicine, communications, transportation, energy, and many other areas. So science gets appropriated as a weapon. And it's only a small step then to use it as part of a rhetorical strategy. Science has always been fighting against religion, we're told. It's always been suppressed by religion at every turn. The two are in irreconcilable conflict, and science must eventually triumph. The problem with this rhetoric is that it's a myth, and it's simply not true. We ought to assess this claim like scientists, looking beyond the rhetoric and seeing if it's actually substantiated by the evidence. And I will argue tonight that the idea that science and faith have been locked in a perpetual battle, with science being suppressed at every turning point, simply does not hold up to proper historical scrutiny. And this is something that I think can be accepted as a historical fact, whether or not you're personally religious, whether you're a theist, agnostic, atheist, or anywhere in between. So tonight, there are 4 things that I think will help us diffuse this conflict model view. Firstly, we need to properly understand the history of science. Second, we need to appreciate philosophy of science. Third, we should examine the contemporary research which tells us what scientists and the public actually think. And finally and critically, we need to embrace a richer and non-pejorative definition of faith. Let's talk about history of science. Professional practicing historians of science, those with subject matter expertise, have resolutely rejected the idea that science and religion have always been in irreconcilable conflict. This view is simply not supported by the evidence. Instead, scholars have been increasingly asking the question of why modern science arose in the particular context of Western Europe in the 16th century and not anywhere else. Now, the term science itself didn't even come into being until the 19th century. Prior to that time, scientists were known as natural philosophers. And many cultures, of course, explored the world in a proto-scientific way. But what's distinctive about the scientific revolution in Europe was the methodology it developed that broke away from the science of Aristotle, which was dominant at the time. The classical Greek approach was thoroughly rationalistic and relied on logic, authority, and generally broad, uncritical observations of the natural world. But by contrast, the scientific method developed by key figures of the scientific revolution was a corporate, probabilistic, incremental and highly empirical approach. And leading historians of science such as Peter Harrison and John Hedley Brooke have pointed out that the adoption of this method was made possible by some very specific worldview assumptions that were held by its proponents. These preconditions included the assumption that the cosmos and the natural world were ordered and reliable, the product of a rational mind that rendered it rationally tractable and accessible. This led to the idea of laws of nature, which govern the world, in contrast to the prevailing ancient view that objects were governed by their own internal properties. But secondly, human beings did not occupy a privileged position when it came to obtaining knowledge. If anything, thinkers like Francis Bacon were highly sceptical regarding human nature as fallen and prone to corruption and error. This was a stark contrast to the assumptions held by Aristotle and other cultures. As evidence that the theological presuppositions of these founders of modern science may have played a significant part, the historian Rodney Stark studied the religious beliefs of the 52 most prominent natural philosophers at the time of the scientific revolution. His findings were that 62% of them could be classified as devout, 35 were conventionally religious, and just 3.8%, just 2 individuals, could be classified as sceptical. Stark concludes that their belief in God gave them confidence that the physical world, in all its complexity and vast extent, could be understood. As a matter of historical fact, modern science has developed from an understanding of the world as God's ordained creation with its own inherent rationality. And if you've ever taken the time to read the writings of these early pioneers, you will see Stark's analysis validated. Their writings confirm how genuinely devout they really were. Kepler wrote commentaries on the Psalms. Newton was highly interested in matters of biblical interpretation and theology. The same goes for Copernicus, Bacon, Pascal, Leibniz, Boyle, Faraday, Maxwell, Mendel, Heisenberg, and many more distinguished pioneers of science. They were genuinely devout. What about Galileo, I hear you ask? Well, what this historical data shows is that the Galileo affair was not an explicit instance of science versus religion. It was a conflict between 2 competing views within the Catholic Church about how Scripture should be interpreted and whether or not it was making claims which conflicted with observational data. Indeed, as Professor Peter Harrison, historian of science, tells us, there was no stronger supporter of astronomy between the 12th and the 18th centuries than the Catholic Church. What sticks out about the Galileo affair is how unusual the situation was. Let me turn now to philosophy of science, another critical discipline, one which helps us to think carefully about what science is and what are the limits of science, two of which I'll point out tonight. The first limitation of science is its scope. Science is by definition limited to the natural world. But if you're asking a question about the supernatural from something outside nature and hence not constrained by it, then science simply isn't the right tool to use. Science can only operate in the sphere of the natural. Its very methodology depends on having regular, reliable, repeatable natural laws. It requires multiple observations. It requires falsification. Indeed, even now, a very substantive debate exists within the scientific community itself regarding what particular activities classify as science. As a case in point, consider this rather handsome fellow here, Professor Brian Cox. You may have seen his BBC documentaries on our universe, or as he likes to call it, our universe. These shows are presented as scientific content, but what you actually tend to see is a complicated mixture of hard science and speculative metaphysics, seamlessly blended together, accompanied by stunning visuals and soul-stirring music. The problem with these shows is it's not often readily apparent what caveats are in place regarding the scientific pronouncements that are made. For instance, we do know with quite a bit of confidence how many galaxies there are, what their size and distribution is, how they form, and so on. But we are only just starting to discover how many exoplanets there are in our local neighbourhood, their composition, and whether any of these could potentially support life. We're still learning. It's early days. And then there are highly speculative proto-scientific claims like certain formulations of string theory, or whether there are other universes beyond our own, the so-called multiverse. Perhaps there are even an infinite number of universes. If that's the case, why should ours be thought of as anything special? But not all scientists are comfortable with this infiltration of more speculative hypotheses. The highly distinguished cosmologist Professor George Ellis recently published a letter in the journal Nature calling for the scientific community to defend the integrity of physics. Ellis's words are striking. Fundamentally, the multiverse explanation relies on string theory, which is as yet unverified, and on speculative mechanisms for realising different physics in different sister universes. It is not, in our opinion, robust, let alone testable. Ellis argued that science should only be awarded to theories that are testable. Only then, he said, can we defend science from attack. There's a second big limitation on science, and that's the ethical dimension. Philosophers call this the is-ought problem. Science can tell you what is, but it cannot tell you what ought to be. Science can tell you how to build a nuclear weapon. It cannot tell you whether you should drop one. Science can describe the laws that govern how things within the universe behave. It cannot tell us why those laws exist in the first place. Science can tell us how long ago the universe came into being. It cannot tell us whether it was created by something outside the universe. Science can tell us how tall the average human being is. It cannot tell us whether a tall person is more important than a short person, or whether a wealthy person is more important than a poor person, or whether the people sitting at this table are more important than the people sitting at the table over at the edge of the wall. These examples show us something important, that science does not and cannot provide a totally objective and independent and prescriptive account of all domains of human experience. And put simply, science is not the only type of rational thought. We need metaphysics, we need the humanities, we need ethics, we need philosophy, we need worldviews. theology and other developed non-religious worldviews such as secular humanism. Science can inform these disciplines, but they do not derive from science. Let's turn now to the contemporary research. What do scientists and the general public actually think about the relationship between science and religion today? By far the largest study ever undertaken has been that of Professor Elaine Eklund of Rice University. Her study surveyed 1,700 scientists from elite universities in the United States, where science-religion divides are frequently the most heated. Their views were compared with those of the general public. Respondents were asked to choose whether they thought science and religion were in conflict, but I consider myself on the side of religion. Conflict, but I consider myself on the side of science. Independence, so they refer to different aspects of reality. Or collaboration, they can be used to help support each other. The results showed that the conflict model was less well supported than either the independence or collaboration models for both scientists and the general public. In addition, Eklund assessed the religiosity of scientists compared to the general public. And she found that scientists indeed had slightly lower levels of religiosity, but it was far from a monochromatic picture. For instance, the statement, "I know God really exists and I have no doubts about it," 50% of the general public said yes, whereas 36% of scientists said yes. But this is still a huge number. The exception here were evangelical Protestant scientists who actually demonstrated higher levels of religiosity than the general public. Now, Eklund followed up this by conducting a massive 275 qualitative interviews to investigate these questions, finding that scientists' beliefs were complex and challenged misconceptions. They identified positively with the spiritual label. Even a proportion of atheist scientists describe themselves as spiritual. Scientists seem to be more comfortable with the concept of agnosticism and provisionality of knowledge, perhaps because of their training. But crucially, Eklund found that the actual formation of their religious views was typically not driven by their scientific training. Their religious views, be they a theist or an atheist, were typically formed earlier, before they'd begun formal scientific training. This is an interesting observation. Finally, what Eklund found from these interviews was that the number of scientists who held views as strident as those of Richard Dawkins could be counted on the fingers of one hand out of 275. This in itself is a very striking finding. So we've spoken a bit about science, history, philosophy of science, and what people actually think. But what about faith? As I said earlier, I think we need to avoid pejorative definitions of the term. One thing scientists and engineers do very well is to build things. And here is my favourite scientific instrument of all time, the Hubble Space Telescope. Those impressive images you've been seeing on the screen tonight all come from this one telescope. In its life, it has generated over 10,000 scientific papers from the raw data alone and massively expanded our view of the cosmos and our place in it. But what's often overlooked with Hubble is how unimpressive it was in the beginning. It was launched to great fanfare aboard Space Shuttle Discovery in 1990. However, when it was subsequently activated, the images that came through were less than impressive. A lot of very embarrassed scientists worked overtime to find the cause, and it was determined that a severe optical defect called spherical aberration existed, which would require extensive repair. So in 1993, on STS-61, a group of astronauts bravely headed out on the shuttle Endeavour to rendezvous with the Hubble and conduct the most sophisticated series of extravehicular activities yet performed in space. What's interesting about this is that here we have a real-life instance of people venturing out on a very dangerous mission with significant risk to their own persons, where there was no guarantee of success. And yet they ventured anyway. And I think this captures the very essence of faith. They had to have faith in their own abilities. They had to have faith in the competence of the hundreds of engineers and technicians on the ground supporting them. They had to commit themselves and persevere in the face of difficulties to achieve an outcome which in many ways lay beyond their ultimate control. This is what faith is. This is what good faith is. Well, we know how the story ends. Thanks to the efforts of these brave astronauts, the Hubble was restored, and the results were stunning. Since that time, the Hubble has gone on to generate some jaw-dropping imagery, like this one, the Panchromatic Hubble Andromeda Treasury, or the FAT. I love that acronym. And indeed, the beautiful images you see gracing your tables tonight. And as a result, we now know just how vast and impressive our universe is. This next image here is called the Hubble Extreme Deep Field. What they did was they essentially took the Hubble, focused it at a piece of sky the size of a grain of sand held at arm's length, and they let it soak up as much light as it could. And if you zoom right in closely to this image, you can see that each pinprick of light is not just a star, it's an entire galaxy. Indeed, all of the images that are on your tables tonight together would fill less than 10% of this one image. That image there shows you, in comparison to the moon in the sky, just how tiny the extra deep field image was. One thing is clear: our universe is unimaginably vast. But equally clear is that our universe is held together by an elegant and sophisticated series of laws which hold true throughout the universe, which permit the formation of complex structures like galaxies, stars, and the generation of a plenitude of elements which can undergo molecular self-assembly, forming such wonderful structures as DNA, the foundation of life. In my opinion, the more we observe the universe, the more it looks like a work of immense intelligence. And if it looks like the work of an immense intelligence, maybe it is the work of an immense intelligence. This is a perfectly reasonable proposition. The idea that there is an intelligence beyond the physical universe has great explanatory power, coherence, and elegance. In short, it makes good sense. Now, as I've said before, the question of whether anything lies beyond our universe is not a scientific question. It's a metaphysical question, a philosophical one, and it's one that ultimately comes down to our own personal judgment. But given what we see in the skies above us, I find it unsurprising that the vast majority of human beings who have ever lived find this idea of a higher power to be both reasonable and compelling. I'll finish up with a shot of astronaut Joseph Tanner, himself an aerospace engineer and a Christian. He was on the next Hubble servicing mission, which greatly enhanced the capabilities of the telescope. And this may be one of the most epic selfies ever. So now let's literally bring things back down to earth. Why am I here tonight? I'm sure a lot of my secular and sceptical friends would say, James, what are you doing here? Why would you want to support something like chaplaincy? Shouldn't this sort of thing be kept as far away from government and education as possible? Well, in truth, when it comes to delivering quality and holistic education, I support a lot of things. I support teaching students philosophy, critical reasoning skills, the ability to think clearly. I support general religious education, taught at a high standard, so different worldviews that have shaped world history can be properly presented and understood. How can we hope to communicate in a civil manner with each other if we don't understand such things? I support specific religious education, where the history and influence of a particular religion can be presented for those who opt in to hear it. And I'd hope that, in my case, Christianity could contain similar material to what I've presented tonight. We need to do this in a way, of course, which respects individual choice and doesn't needlessly divide or exclude. But I think that's possible. I support ethics classes where young people can be encouraged at a high level to grapple with concepts like the is-ought problem that I mentioned earlier, to learn about virtue ethics, consequentialist ethics and the like, and why they're different. I support counsellors to help students navigate the social and psychological complexities of what can be, for many, a very trying time. And I support chaplains, because I think that it's entirely reasonable for young people to ask questions such as, why am I here? What's the purpose of my life? How can I live a good life? What's the meaning of it all? We are an insatiably curious species. And the same spirit that launched the Hubble, the same spirit that drove people at great risk to attempt to repair it, has been and will continue to be a fundamental and defining part of the human experience. These big questions are, for complex reasons, often underdeveloped in the classroom, and for some even on the home front. So if we have the option of giving students the ability to have opt-in discussions about life, about meaning, about purpose, with people who have invested their lives in grappling with those questions, who represent a developed and influential worldview, and if they have a caring and constructive attitude, then I wholly support it. So I support all of these things, not as alternatives, but together, because I think that as a package, they are an integral part of human spirituality. And what is genuine spirituality? By any sensible definition, it includes seeking what is good, seeking what is true, what is beautiful. It involves dwelling on questions of meaning and value and purpose. It's about flourishing as people, about respecting the natural world and our fellow human travellers. It's about embracing the transcendent and seeking something greater than ourselves. That's what spirituality is. So let's not be apologetic about it. This is what makes us human. It is my firm belief that science and faith can have a mutually enriching relationship, and so too can education and spirituality, this basic feature of human experience. I believe a positive future lies not in conflict, but in harmony. Thank you.